Today I have for you another incredible game from one of the most promising chess players alive today. I haven't felt this optimistic about anyone since the 13-year-old Magnus Carlsen nearly defeated Garry Kasparov way back in 2004. This Argentine prodigy, who's been called the Messi of chess, just broke a record this past year, becoming the youngest international master in history at age 10 and now at age 11 with a FIDE rating of 2433, a peak online blitz rating of 3146. The sensational Faustino Oro is showing no signs of slowing down. He just scored yet another win against the current number 1 or number 2 rated blitz player on chess.com, depending on what week it is, Hikaru Nakamura, a true legend of the game who's been playing chess for around 30 years, but in this game, you're going to see him get taken down with shocking brutality, falling victim to a beautiful queen sacrifice executed by a mere child, who's only been playing chess for a total of 4 years. So let's dive right into this fascinating 3-minute blitz encounter. Hikaru Nakamura is playing white and opens with b3, known as the Nimzo-Larsen attack. It's considered a hyper-modern opening in that it just kind of lets black have his way in the center for the moment, giving him the choice of either e5 or d5. Faustino goes with the latter, known as the classical variation. We have bishop to b2 from Hikaru, preventing e5. c5 from Faustino, taking a bit more central control that way. We get knight to f3. And now for the first highly deviant move of the game, a6, which is seen in only about 1 out of 90 online games that reach this position. But it does make some sense, especially when considering that the main line goes knight to c6, e3, knight to f6, and bishop to b5, pinning the knight. So he's preventing that bishop to b5, albeit a bit earlier than necessary. Play continues e3. We have knight to f6 from Faustino, which is interesting. He played such an early a6 to secure his knight's position on c6, yet he doesn't play it, which gives Hikaru the opportunity to now strike at his d-pawn with the move c4, which he didn't play, but it just might be the best move, since black cannot respond with the space-gaining d4, as he could have done if he had his knight on c6 to support it, since here it just loses a pawn. But Hikaru opts for d4, which is okay, but it does allow black to grab the central pawn majority with c takes d4, now played by Faustino, giving Hikaru a slight dilemma. Does he recapture with e takes d5, maintaining a pawn presence on the central d4 square, keeping the e5 square on lockdown, although blocking his dark squared bishop? Does he play queen takes d4 or bishop takes d4, allowing knight to c6 to come with tempo? Or does he play the move played in the game, knight takes d4, which is the engine's least favorite option as it allows black to play e5, a move rejected by Faustino, possibly because knight to f3 would come with a double attack on e5. But after e4, knight back to d4, and bishop to d6, black is actually the slightly preferred side, despite his backward d-pawn, since he has gained space, as well as some attacking prospects on the king side, where white is a bit more vulnerable without his knight on f3. But in the game, Faustino plays the less challenging e6, just trying to be safe and solid. We have knight to d2 from Hikaru, which is far superior to knight to c3, since it keeps the diagonal open for his dark squared bishop. Bishop to d6 next, pointing at the king side. c4, striking at the center. It's a good move. Faustino castles, at which point white's best move is probably c takes d5, eliminating black's central pawn majority. But Hikaru opts for bishop to e2, when the engine is again giving e5 followed by e4 as best for black. But Faustino plays knight to c6, to which Hikaru responds knight takes c6. It's not a terrible move, but it's not ideal either, since after b takes c6, he's just given black more central pawn control, since the pawn on c6 is there to recapture on d5 if c takes d5 is played, which will allow black to maintain that central pawn majority. Hikaru now castles, at which point Faustino, apparently now emboldened by his newly acquired central pawn influence, decides to push in the center with e5. It is a good move, giving him that ideal pawn duo, and he's now open to diagonal for his light squared bishop to possibly come out to f5. Hikaru decides that would be a little too much activity, and so now prevents it with queen to c2. We have queen to e7 from Faustino. Good move, keeping his options open for where to put his light-squared bishop. Rook f to d1 from Hikaru. Looks very normal, placing his rook on his only half-open file. Faustino plays h6, which doesn't seem to do much more than give his king some luft. Other than that, it just kind of seems like a waiting move. He's still not ready to declare his intentions with the light-squared bishop. Hikaru responds knight to f1, looking to reroute to g3 and then possibly hop into f5, supported by the queen. Next comes bishop to e6, knight to g3, at which point Faustino decides to prevent knight to f5 with the move e4, blocking the white queen's access to that square. And this move is okay, but it does give up some of the dynamic potential of that central pawn duo. It's generally better to keep the two pawns abreast until there is a better reason to push one of them, which is why g6 may have been a slightly better way to keep that knight out of f5. But okay, rook a to c1 now from Hikaru, completing his development, putting his rook on a file that is about to open. And now we get a very provocative move from Faustino, h5, which objectively speaking is nothing to write home about, but I like it anyway. It's ultra aggressive, threatening h4, kicking the knight back from whence it came, with h3 next, biting into white's kingside. So how to respond as white? Now, if anyone is wondering about knight takes h5, this would not be a very good idea, and if you're not sure why, take a moment, study the position, and you'll probably figure out why. But the problem is that after knight takes h5 and bishop takes h5, queen to h4 attacks both the pawn on h2 and the bishop on h5, who is severely lacking squares, and will be lost one way or another unless it's dropped back to e2, but this unfortunately runs into a checkmate in 2 with queen takes h2 check, king to f1, and queen to h1 checkmate. So Hikaru, being the tactical wizard that he is never going to fall for something like that, and instead comes up with some tactical trickery of his own. After c takes d5 and c takes d5, there is now a tactical resource present in this position for white. See if you can spot it, but here it is. White's best move is bishop takes f6, to which Faustino now must respond queen takes f6, unless he wants to severely compromise his kingside pawn structure with g takes f6. That would not be good. But since queen takes f6 removed defense from the bishop on e7, Hikaru now has knight takes e4, since d takes e4 would lose the bishop to rook takes d6. So did Faustino see this combination coming? Who knows? But he does find the correct response, which is not d takes e4, it's bishop takes h2 check. And after king takes h2, he's able to recapture the knight on e4, restoring material equality. For if white were to continue queen takes pawn on e4, then there'd be queen takes f2, and if bishop takes h5, there'd be queen takes a2, which is why after d takes e4, it's better to play king to g1, defending f2, giving white a bit of an advantage. But the fact that I'm drawing arrows here has probably already clued you in to the fact that in the game, d takes e4 was not played by Faustino. Instead, for whatever reason, he decided to throw in queen to h4 check, which incredibly is a losing blunder. Hikaru responds king to g1, and after d takes e4, the black queen is defending the pawn on e4. However, she can now be driven away with a move that Hikaru did not find, and that is g3, when the black queen has no squares from which she can maintain defense of the e-pawn. And so after something like queen to g5 and queen takes e4, white has the winning endgame with his extra pawn on the queen side and his more active rooks. Black has some weak pawns that can be targeted, but Hikaru missed this opportunity, and instead of playing the winning g3, he went with queen to c5, which still favors white, though probably not winning. He is targeting the pawn on h5 for the moment. Faustino defends with g6, and now for a very strong move from Hikaru, queen to e5, with all kinds of threatening prospects, including g3, which would again win the e4 pawn by driving the black queen away from its defense, and depending on where she goes, there's even the possibility of a bishop sacrifice on h5, followed by queen takes h5, king to g2, and rook to h1 with a winning attack. So the best way for black to deal with this is to challenge the white queen's position right away with rook f to e8, defending the e-pawn through the bishop with the threat of a discovered attack with bishop takes b3. which would pretty much force the white queen to abandon her post on e5, but again, Faustino blunders with bishop to f5. It looks reasonable on the surface, but unlike rook f to e8, this is a purely defensive move, putting black's bishop in a passive position where it's functioning more like a tall pawn, giving Hikaru another chance to gain a crushing advantage with the move rook to c6, which fortunately for Faustino, he didn't play. But this move rook to c6 comes with a double attack on a6, and if, for example, the pawn is pushed with a5, then there's rook d to d6, when white has achieved total positional domination in the center of the board, while the black rooks are undeveloped, and the black queen is sidelined and getting pretty short on squares. So there's a lot of specific variations we could plow through here to demonstrate why black is totally finished, but I'm going to leave those to your imagination and press on with the game, where in this position, Hikaru, instead of playing the most crushing move, rook to c6, went with bishop to c4, blocking the c1 rook's file, but it does pin black's f-pawn. Maybe Hikaru is hoping to exploit that down the road by capturing on g6, and this position still heavily favors white, though he's not necessarily winning if black continues with something like a5 or rook a to e8, but instead, Faustino plays queen to g4, just going for the caveman attack, planning h4 and h3. But as is typical with many caveman attacks, this can be easily dealt with. The most convincing move for white here is queen to f6, depriving the black queen of her only escape squares, rendering her immobile and vulnerable to being trapped, with rook to d2 followed by bishop to e2. Now black does have ways to save his queen, but none of them are very good and all of them are losing. But this resource apparently escaped Hikaru, who instead went with rook to d6, which is not nearly as convincing, though it may still be winning. He's attacking a6, also threatening to play bishop to d5, followed by rook to c4, ganging up on the e4 pawn. So Faustino, very prudently, like a prudent caveman, decides to ignore this attack on his a6 pawn and just barrels forward with h4. It is the best move, after which white's best defense against the coming h3 is king to h2. Not played by Hikaru, he went for the material with bishop takes a6, but the point is that after h3, white has rook to g1, resulting in a rather fascinating situation with this tension between the g and h pawns, when neither side is going to want to be the one to initiate the capture, at least not for the moment. The black queen and the white rook are kind of in a standoff, both sort of being tied down to defense. The rook is of course defending against the mate on g2, and the black queen is defending against g takes h3, opening the rook's eyes towards the black king, since the recapture queen takes h3 would be checkmate. And from here, the engine is giving rook a to e8 with about a 1-pawn advantage to white. But getting back to the materialistic move that Hikaru played in the game, where in this position he opted for bishop takes a6 instead of the correct king to h2, this gives Faustino the opportunity to now open the h-file by playing h3. When white's only good way to defend g2 is going to be to drop his queen back, and after the pawns and queens are exchanged, black apparently has ample compensation for his pawn deficit, due to the activity he gets down the opened h-file, after king to g7 and rook to h8, with the help of his light squared bishop, which can post up on f3. And in case anyone is wondering, I should mention that after h3, g3 is never going to be a good response. Here it immediately fails to rook takes a6, followed by queen to f3, threatening mate on g2, and white is not going to last very long. But in the game, Faustino rejects the immediate h3, why, I really can't tell you, and continues in what is quickly becoming a comedy of errors with yet another blunder, rook f to d8, allowing Hikaru to now trade off a pair of heavy pieces with rook takes d8 check, which is not good for black, since piece trades are generally not your friend when you're down in material and counting on your attacking prospects to save you. But after rook takes d8, Hikaru returns the favor by not playing king to h2, which the engine again gives as best for white, and instead decides to challenge Faustino's queen with queen to f4, giving Faustino yet another chance to equalize with queen takes f4, which I really can't fault him for not playing in a blitz game, but the point is, after e takes f4, you have rook to a8, hitting the bishop. If it moves, you get to grab the a2 pawn. There is rook to c6 defending, but then rook to d8 threatens to come into d2, when white would still be winning with rook to c2 if black didn't now have e3 with the discovered attack. And despite there being a few more pertinent details in this position that you may or may not be able to work out on your own, I'm gonna have to just go full Forrest Gump here and tell you that's all I have to say about that. We need to press on with the move Faustino played in the game, which is not queen takes f4, but rather queen to h5, which is another big fat blunder. Hikaru responds bishop to c4, which is excellent, converging on that f7 square, and so restricting the f5 bishop's mobility. Faustino does finally play h3, but here it's lost most of its sting. White can simply capture on h3 and then start pushing his queenside pawns, and black has nothing. He'd love to get his bishop onto f3, but then queen takes f7 check will be the end of him. He'd also love to play king to g7, preparing rook to h8, but then white has queen to e5 check, running black into trouble that way. But wouldn't you know it, Hikaru once again throws away the win with queen to c7. Okay, it looks nice, hitting the rook, hitting f7 twice, but after rook to f8, defending, the situation has changed. If white now captures on h3, bishop takes h3 as possible, since f7 is adequately defended, and then with the black queen guarding against queen to e5 check, black is ready to play king to g7, followed by rook to h8, once the white queen drops back to defend against checkmate by the black queen and the bishop, once that bishop goes to f3. So, long story short, black can hold this position because of his mating threats. Of course, white doesn't have to take on h3. Hikaru instead immediately drops the queen back to g3, allowing Faustino to initiate the pawn trade with h takes g2. This also leads to equality after queen takes g2 and bishop to g4, looking to get into f3. Hikaru responds queen to h2. He of course wants the queen trade, which would give him a winning position since he has that extra pawn. Faustino wisely avoids it with queen to f5. He of course knows that his attacking prospects against the white king are his only saving grace here. We have a little back and forth, queen to f4, queen back to h5, queen to h2, and queen to f5, when it seems Faustino is satisfied to make a draw, but Hikaru is not. He now breaks the repetition with bishop to f1, looking to get his bishop involved in the defense. We have bishop to f3, bishop to g2, and king to g7, preparing rook to h8. And it's starting to look a little dicey for white here. But Hikaru is still just fine after queen to h3, again looking for the queen trade. Faustino of course says no with queen to g5. We have queen to g3 from Hikaru. He's saying it's either a queen trade or a threefold repetition, young man. But after queen to f5, Hikaru suddenly abandons the repetition, which he should have continued now with queen to h3 with total equality, and instead decides to play bishop to h3. A remarkable blunder, giving Faustino his choice of two crushing moves. Take a moment and try to spot them if you'd like, but here they are. Black can win with either rook to h8, attacking the h3 bishop twice, when bishop takes queen on g4 is unplayable, since rook to h1 will be checkmate. So you can defend with king to h2, but then bishop to g4 will attack the now pinned bishop a third time, and white is completely hosed. The second crushing move, played now by Faustino, is queen to h5. When, unlike the previous position, where white was immediately able to challenge the black queen on that file with queen to h2, here the bishop is in the way, rook to h8 is coming, and if white tries bishop to g2, then there's rook to h8, threatening a beautiful checkmate beginning with queen to h1. We're actually going to get to see this executed in a moment, but in this position, the engine gives king to f1 as the only way to avoid checkmate in 11 moves or less, and white can struggle on for a bit, but eventual mate is inevitable. There's too many variations to comprehensively cover here, but the engine is giving queen to d5 next, looking to get the rook to h5, threatening to go to g5. The writing is on the wall, and hopefully sufficiently legible for our purposes here. But getting back to the game, after Faustino plays queen to h5, Hikaru doesn't even attempt to address the threat of rook to h8, and instead just blissfully pushes a pawn with b4. apparently thinking that after rook to h8, that bishop to g2 is an adequate defense against checkmate. A remarkable oversight for a tactical beast like Hikaru, which you can't even blame on being low on time since he still had 50 seconds left on his clock. And here Faustino took only about a second to find the forced mate in 2 moves, beginning with queen to h1 check, which prompted immediate resignation from Hikaru, who realized that after bishop takes h1, that rook takes h1 is checkmate. So what a rich and complex struggle that was. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one, and tell me if you think Faustino Oro has what it takes to become the next Magnus Carlsen, or even the next Aragaisi or Gukesh after one of them seizes control of the chess throne. All I know is that the next 10 years are going to be very interesting. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I will see you very soon.